Okay, let's unpack this. It really makes you stop and think when you realize how we were taught about the history of infectious diseases.
It really does.
I clearly remember being told, and I know many medical colleagues have the same education, that vaccines were the absolute game changer. The primary reason for the huge drop in deaths from things like measles, whooping cough.
That's the standard narrative, absolutely.
But here's the thing that always stuck with me. We also learned that other diseases we didn't have vaccines for back then, think scarlet fever, typhus, they also declined dramatically.
Right.
And that was put down to better social conditions. So it immediately makes you ask, what if our understanding of this whole picture is, well, maybe not quite complete?
And that's exactly the core of what makes this so compelling, and it's the perfect place to start our deep dive today. We're going to be looking closely at some of the ideas presented in excerpts from Dissolving Illusions, Disease, Vaccines, and Forgotten History
By Suzanne Humphries and Roman Bastrianic. And this was actually shared with us by one of you, our listeners.
That's right. And the goal today isn't to, accept or dismiss anything outright.
No, not at all.
We want to really dig into the information presented in these excerpts, explore those alternative ways of looking at how disease and mortality changed over time.
And really highlight those key factors beyond just vaccination that might have played a much bigger role than we're often led to believe.
Exactly. We want to pull out those crucial insights, those nuggets, so you can get a clearer, more nuanced picture without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Okay, so where do we start? The authors themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. They talk about their own background, starting with that same unquestioning belief in vaccination as the most powerful health tool out there.
Like most of us were taught.
Pretty much. And they point out how this view is heavily reinforced in scientific journals and any differing views, often quickly labeled unscientific.
And it gets pretty serious for those who do question it. One of the authors talks about facing, well, serious professional consequences, formal misconduct charges even.
Just for raising questions about vaccine safety.
Yeah, and being labeled as promoting junk science, it really shows the kind of intense pressure doctors can be under to, stick to the accepted line.
Which leads to a really critical question the author poses. Why is the possibility, just the possibility, that the universal childhood vaccination program might not be this perfect, unmitigated success?
Yeah.
Why can't we even entertain that idea openly?
Or even consider other ways to achieve health.
Exactly. Why isn't that given more serious thought?
It makes you wonder. The author quotes George Bernard Shaw saying something like, a doctor's dread of doing anything not universally accepted gets mistaken for honor.
That really hits home, doesn't it, considering the experience described?
Totally. If a patient questions things, they might be told they don't understand. But if a doctor does,
Then they could face career-threatening stuff.
yeah. So the author went on this journey, did a ton of research.
And came to believe that maybe the common story vaccines wiped out past diseases might be, well, inaccurate. She started asking why data challenging this seemed to get ignored.
It shows how strong a belief can become, even if history suggests something more complex.
Right. The public, maybe trusting the authorities, just accepted the narrative without digging into the history themselves.
And then it gets really personal for the author. There's a powerful story about her own child.
Yeah, having a reaction after a vaccine and later developing seizures.
And when she sought medical help, the neurologist just dismissed the idea that nutrition could play any role in managing them.
Which is fascinating because the author then did her own research and found studies suggesting nutrients could help brain health.
So she put together this plan for her son: omega-3s, B vitamins, magnesium, other nutrients, an organic diet.
And the result?
Quite amazing, actually. After a few months, his EEG showed no more seizure activity.
Wow.
As the author points out, it really highlights how limiting beliefs within medicine can sometimes block considering other potentially helpful approaches, like nutrition.
That experience must have really fueled her questioning. She mentions another conversation with a doctor who just laughed at the idea diet could be linked to meningitis.
While confidently saying vaccines got rid of smallpox and polio.
And the author admits pretty honestly that at that time, her own understanding of the full history wasn't complete either.
It's quite an admission. It shows how deep those success stories run in the profession.
Yeah. And then she talks about trying to advocate for her kidney failure patients, trying to protect them from vaccines when their health was already fragile.
And the pushback she got? That's revealing.
Totally. Basically told to stop interfering, and if she thought vaccines caused kidney failure, she had to prove it. Conduct her own study, get funding.
Which really flips the burden of proof, doesn't it? Shouldn't safety be demonstrated before widespread use?
That's a huge point the book makes. She calls it opening Pandora's box, encountering doublespeak. Like, she could technically write an order to hold a vaccine, but then got told off for doing it too often.
Must have been incredibly frustrating.
You'd think. And the reactions from colleagues varied. Some were indifferent. A few more open-minded ones did see a possible link with kidney issues.
But they stayed quiet.
Mostly, yeah. Probably afraid of the consequences.
Yeah.
Interestingly, she found more understanding from parents and other people outside the strict medical hierarchy.
She also makes a really important distinction, vaccinated versus immunized.
Yes, that often gets blurred. Getting a shot doesn't automatically mean you have immunity.
Whereas someone who got the disease and recovered is immune even without a vaccine.
Precisely. And she briefly touches on the original DTP vaccine, the whole cell version for pertussis. Stronger response, maybe, but also more safety concerns than later versions. Still used in some places today.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Then the book shifts focus dramatically, right, to living conditions back then.
Oh, absolutely. And the picture it paints of the 1800s, early 1900s, it's grim.
Really grim. Overcrowded tenements, shared toilets, dark, damp basements full of vermin.
Filthy streets, garbage everywhere, polluted air and water. The photos mention 1.2, 1.4, 1.5. They really show it, just density and waste.
The book compares it to modern shanty towns or refugee camps.
And it's no surprise those conditions were breeding grounds for disease, leading to sky-high infant and child mortality, life expectancy sometimes under 20 for workers.
They quote from the bitter cry of outcast London, pestilential human rookeries, poisonous gases from sewage. You can almost smell it.
There's that striking analogy from Southwood Smith, comparing a fever patient's room in a cramped London flat to a stagnant pool full of dead locusts, the poison being the same.
And it wasn't just human waste. Factories just dumped stuff everywhere. London smog in the 1850s, plus rotting animal carcasses in the streets. Yikes.
On top of the environment, the food was terrible too. Nutrient deficient, often contaminated. That 1865 New York report about selling decayed, diseased food, it just weakened people further, especially kids.
So terrible living conditions, terrible food, and then terrible working conditions.
Yeah, the book moves on to labor, particularly child labor.
Yeah.
Photos 2.3 and 2.4 show kids pulling heavy coal carts in mines or sitting alone in the dark all day as trappers.
Just awful. And in factories, too.
Definitely glass making. Paper box factories. Photos 2.8, 2.11, 2.12. Long hours, dangerous machinery, exposure to toxins, lead, mercury, phosphorus, arsenic.
Leading to blindness, poisoning, paralysis, even death.
The description of paper box factories, low ceilings, toxic fumes from glue, fire hazards, it's particularly bleak.
Okay, so this is the backdrop against which we need to understand historical diseases before vaccines became common.
Exactly. The book reminds us about the constant cholera pandemics, driven by contaminated water and lack of basic sanitation.
A constant assault on weakened immune systems.
Then typhus fever, the filth disease, linked directly to poor hygiene, overcrowding, huge outbreaks, especially in wartime, millions dead.
Diphtheria, too, right? A bacterial toxin.
Made worse by slums, poor nutrition. That New York report calling a diphtheria death a sanitary crime really tells you something.
And scarlet fever, another bacterial toxin disease.
Right. So against that reality, the book brings up puerperal fever or childbed fever.
The hand-washing story, or lack thereof.
Precisely. Caused mainly by doctors and medical staff not washing their hands when attending births.
It's such a sobering part of medical history. Dr. Holmes, Dr. Semmelweis, advocating for hand washing and getting ridiculed for it.
Semmelweis's tragic end in an asylum.
Mm-hmm.
It's just awful. A stark reminder of the resistance to such a simple, life-saving measure.
And the death rates were unbelievable, over 50% in some hospitals.
Actually high. Semmelweis even showed death rates were way higher with doctors compared to midwives, who usually didn't do internal exams after handling cadavers.
And it wasn't just lack of hand washing. Other practices like routine chloroform, forceps
also contributed to unnecessary deaths. The author argues that vaccine proponents often just gloss over this history, how basic hygiene could have saved so many lives.
It really shifts the perspective. The idea that doctors, while now promoting vaccines, their predecessors kind of created the conditions for high disease rates by ignoring hygiene.
The book contends that improvements in living conditions, nutrition, obstetric care, sanitation, things not related to vaccines, were demonstrably responsible for a huge part of the decline in infectious disease deaths.
Which brings us to a really fundamental point the book makes.
Which is?
The medical profession has backed vaccination since the late 1700s, but there's never been a proper large-scale controlled trial comparing vaccinated versus truly unvaccinated people.
That's a pretty stark claim.
Yeah.
And the book adds that even today, the CDC admits they don't know the exact antibody level needed for smallpox protection. Historically, just having a scar was often considered proof of immunity.
And the origin of the vaccinia virus itself is murky, the one used for smallpox.
Yeah, despite the name coming from vaca, cow, Jenner thought it came from horse grease. Some even used material from goats.
So not always cowpox.
Apparently not consistently. An 1829 Lancet piece mentions Jenner using horse lymph. By 1834, there were 3 different theories: horse origin, modified smallpox in cows, or a natural cow disease. So what was actually in those early vaccines? It's questionable.
And the early results weren't always great either.
Seems that way. Even cow doctors knew smallpox could happen after cowpox. Dr. Drake's 1799 experiment showed kids vaccinated with Jenner's own lymph still got smallpox.
And cowpox itself could sometimes be severe, even fatal.
There were reports, yes. But despite failures to protect, the medical establishment largely stuck with vaccination. Newspapers even reported deaths from smallpox in vaccinated people, or deaths from things like erysipelas after vaccination.
Then came that big 1871-72 smallpox epidemic in Europe. That was a shock.
A rude shock, as the book calls it. Faith in vaccination took a hit. Even in highly vaccinated places like Bavaria, the epidemic was severe, and vaccinated people sometimes got sick before the unvaccinated.
Which leads to the issue of contaminated vaccines.
A huge, often overlooked part of the story. The book argues early smallpox vaccines were basically an unknown broth, potentially full of microbes other than cowpox, even the pure lymph.
Because of how they were made. On live animals.
Exactly. Growing the virus on calves or heifers with open wounds, huge risk of contamination.
Yeah.
They mentioned the 1902 foot and mouth outbreak in Massachusetts traced back to vaccine production.
Wow. Thousands of animals slaughtered, potential spread to humans.
Figure 5.1 illustrates that link. It makes you wonder how many other epidemics might have been caused or worsened by contaminated vaccines. The fallout is hard to calculate.
This brings us to Leicester, England, and the anti-vaccination movement there.
A fascinating story. Despite high vaccination rates, Leicester got hit hard by that 1870s smallpox epidemic. Public faith was shaken. People saw complications they linked to the vaccine itself.
So they objected.
Big time. Growing numbers refused compulsory vaccination. There's a massive public demonstration. People came from all over England, even other countries. Banners calling it a violation of freedom, a poison.
Parents choosing jail over vaccinating their kids. That's intense.
And they had significant public support. They passed resolutions condemning forced vaccination, defending liberty and parental rights.
And the crucial part.
Despite most babies in Leicester not being vaccinated then, there were no major smallpox outbreaks there.
Which directly challenged the official narrative.
Completely. Professor Cruikshank in 1893 suggested the belief in vaccination actually hindered recognizing its futility, and that notification and isolation were likely the real keys to control.
Which ties into the power of the state in enforcing these policies.
By the mid-1800s, government support for vaccination as the only way became deeply entrenched.
And they enforced it. Fines, seizing property.
Imprisonment, yeah, regardless of personal beliefs or dissenting medical views.
The examples are chilling. A health commissioner arrested for not vaccinating his daughter, citing bad family experiences. Fathers jailed in New Jersey. Teachers, students suspended.
And the book briefly connects this to the eugenics movement.
Right, the idea of forced sterilization for the defective.
Forced vaccination served as a kind of precedent for that state overreach into personal health. Eugenics got discredited after the Nazis, thankfully, but it's a disturbing historical parallel.
And the personal stories of harm are heartbreaking. Arthur Smith Jr.'s skin issues, the McCree siblings' sores, mental decline, blindness, paralysis, parents blaming the vaccine.
But thankfully, change was happening elsewhere, too. The rise of sanitary reform.
Yes, public health became a bigger concern. Local governments started setting standards.
The sanitary movement involved all sorts of people: activists, reformers, doctors, clergy, scientists pushing for fixes to those awful insanitary conditions.
Leading to actual legislation in Britain in the 1850s and 60s. Public health authorities with real power.
Regulating sewage, water, pollution, doctors, child labor. Cities started cleaning up. Stockholm sanitation improved after its last cholera epidemic, for instance.
And nutrition was another key piece changing. Breastfeeding.
Right. The shift away from breastfeeding in the mid-1800s towards often poor quality formulas wasn't good for infant health.
But people like George Newman pushed for breastfeeding and also milk pasteurization.
recognizing breastfed babies had less diarrhea. Pasteurization made milk much safer by killing harmful bacteria.
So again, challenging the vaccine-centric view, there were doctors back then saying sanitation and hygiene were the real keys.
Definitely. Dr. Charles Page in 1907 argued exactly that, not injections, for fighting diphtheria.
Dr. Tilden, too, in 1926, saying basic healthy living, sunshine, fresh air, good food, rest, hygiene could prevent many unavoidable diseases.
And Dr. Cumming in 1922 emphasized sanitation over immunization for diphtheria.
Plus, broader socioeconomic changes were happening.
Women's work patterns shifted. Child labor laws improved things gradually, and then you had huge technological advances: electricity, refrigeration, clean water systems, flush toilets.
All vastly improving health.
The book argues these public health and hygiene improvements probably saved way more lives than specific medical treatments. But the medical model, focusing on interventions like vaccines, became dominant, overshadowing these other critical factors.
Which leads to this idea of the amazing decline in infectious disease deaths.
Yeah, the authors argue that by the time lab medicine got really effective, much of the groundwork in reducing deaths had already been laid by reformers focused on social conditions.
And even with smallpox, by the 1920s, a milder form was common, even where vaccination rates were low.
Right, this milder form largely replaced the severe one in the U.S. and didn't seem to revert back.
And here's that key point again. Smallpox vaccination rates dropped significantly in England from the late 1800s, stayed low until compulsion ended in 1948.
Yet the decline in smallpox continued. And even after the last U.S. death, vaccinations continued, causing thousands of hospitalizations from complications.
And it wasn't just smallpox declining.
No, death rates for all infectious diseases dropped massively from the mid-1800s into the 1900s. Sanitation hit bacterial diseases like typhus and typhoid hard, without vaccines.
Scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, chickenpox, diphtheria, all becoming much less deadly.
To the point that by the 1940s, people expected complete eradication due to these ongoing health improvements.
The graphs in the book for whooping cough 11.3 and measles 11.4 really show that, don't they? The huge decline before widespread vaccination.
Absolutely. Measles mortality had dropped almost 100% by the time the vaccine came along. The 1960 death rate in England and Wales was tiny compared to Glasgow in 1908.
What about diphtheria? The vaccine is usually credited there.
Well, the book suggests a closer look at the stats, shows high vaccine uptake didn't always correlate perfectly with lower incidence or severity. It's more complex.
And polio. Dr. Sabin himself said the virus was widespread, but mostly asymptomatic.
Yeah, suggesting the link to wealth might be more about environment and lifestyle. And Dr. Kalakarinos' observation about Aboriginal tribes having no diseases until white settlers arrived makes you think.
Plus, that 1958 Michigan polio epidemic analysis, more than half the cases weren't poliovirus.
Right, other viruses like Echo and Coxsackie caused polio-like illness. It complicates the diagnosis picture.
The book also brings up DDT, the pesticide.
Widely used back then to fight insects, thought to spread polio. Sprayed everywhere, even on kids. People thought it was harmless.
But later evidence showed it could actually help poliovirus thrive.
Yeah, and increase susceptibility. It was phased out around the time polio declined. The timing is noted.
And the link between injections and polio, especially toxic ones.
Yes, particularly things like arsenic and mercury used for syphilis treatment. Arsenic poisoning itself can mimic polio symptoms. Dr. Lovett observed this effect of metallic poisons back in 1908.
Dr. Kalakarinos saw something similar with kids exposed to toxic sprays in cotton areas.
He did, linking it to what was being called polio.
Medical interventions, too, like tonsillectomies.
Linked to increased risk and severity of bulbar polio, yeah.
But then there was Dr. Klenner and vitamin C.
Reporting near 100% success curing polio, even severe cases, with high-dose 5e vitamin C. But his findings were largely ignored or dismissed.
Even though others reported similar success.
Apparently so.
And the book raises that controversial idea of a lab escape causing the 1916 NYC epidemic.
It mentions Dr. H.V. Wyatt's 2011 publication suggesting that possibility linked to Rockefeller Labs. Also touches on the reported disdain for Sister Kenny's non-traditional treatments, and the fact that scientists can create poliovirus synthetically now.
Okay, then the Salk vaccine itself. The final trial report came out after it was licensed.
2 years after, after doctors were already being urged to use it.
And there were known flaws in the inactivation process from the start. Concerns were suppressed.
That's what the book states. And those flaws led directly to live virus in some batches, the Cutter incident.
Causing infection, paralysis, death. Even Paul Offit admitted it was worse than natural polio.
The official explanation was clumping, but maybe incomplete. The surveillance unit tracking cases had limitations, possibly undercounting the harm.
Estimates are staggering. Hundreds of thousands infected, tens of thousands weakened, hundreds paralyzed or dead.
And the safety requirements didn't even guarantee complete inactivation. Swedish scientists found live virus in 30% of cleared batches after cutter.
Dr. Svengard thought they missed something fundamental about the virus, suggesting the U.S. vaccination campaign in '55 caused as much polio as it prevented.
The book's conclusion here is that while poliovirus wasn't the sole cause of poliomyelitis, so the Salk vaccine couldn't have been the magic bullet, despite Salk's heroic image.
And then the other contamination issue, SV40, from monkey kidneys.
Right, simian virus 40. Found in polio vaccines made using monkey kidneys up to the 1980s. Some researchers linked it to human cancers.
But it's controversial.
Highly. Definitive research is lacking, possibly due to conflicts of interest hindering investigation. SV40 is found in tumors, causes genetic damage in labs, causes tumors in animals, but linking it definitively to human cancer isn't widely accepted scientifically.
Okay, what about the oral polio vaccine, OPV, and the situation in India?
There's been this unexpected rise in acute flaccid paralysis, AFP, despite massive OPV campaigns and falling wild polio cases.
And DDT is still used heavily there.
Yes, and kids get a lot of OPV doses, like 15 or more by age 5.
And the Lancet reported a drastic increase in AFP, especially non-polio AFP, after a high-potency vaccine was introduced.
With non-polio AFP being potentially deadlier than wild polio, it raises the question, is the goal just eliminating the wild virus, even if paralysis rates from other causes go up?
Maybe investing in sanitation and nutrition would be better?
The book suggests that, and the WHO plans to stop OPV eventually, ironically because the vaccine itself becomes a risk once wild polio is gone.
Let's touch on DTP concerns, too. That 1946 case of twins dying after the second shot.
Initially dismissed as expected reactions, then the 1948 Pediatrics article on brain damage in healthy infants post-vaccine.
A 1960 article even questioned mass DTP vaccination for generally mild diseases.
And a 1979 report of infant deaths linked to a specific DTP law that had passed safety tests. Studies linked DTP to seizures.
The Institute of Medicine reports in 85 and 94 confirmed links.
To acute encephalopathy, shock-like states, even some deaths, plus many minor reactions. Yet, the belief that DTP isn't linked to permanent brain damage persists among many experts.
And whooping cough itself. Immunity from the vaccine isn't lifelong.
No, hence the booster recommendations now. But pertussis still causes illness and death despite high vaccination rates, and it's likely underreported.
Natural infection immunity lasts longer, potentially giving better herd immunity.
Possibly. The book mentions original antigenic sin, again, how initial exposure shapes future responses. And we're seeing more whooping cough in vaccinated groups, plus vaccine-resistant strains emerging, like in Australia.
Okay, shifting to measles. Historically deadly, yes, but the huge decline in deaths happened before the vaccine.
That's the crucial point, shown in graphs 14.1 and 14.2, a 99.96% drop in England before the vaccine.
And you can get sick from measles without the rash, even with antibodies. Outbreaks happen in highly vaccinated populations.
Yes, and diagnosis in vaccinated people is tricky because it can look different. Vaccine failures happened for various reasons before 1980.
The book raises antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE, and original antigenic sin, OAS again,
as possibilities that antibodies, even vaccine-induced ones, could potentially make things worse under certain circumstances. Our immune system understanding is incomplete. Measles diagnosis criteria even changed post-vaccine.
Using immune serum globulin, ISG, for measles prevention had potential downsides.
It might increase risk for other issues later. And pre-existing antibodies, maternal or vaccine-induced, can mess with infant immune development and vaccine response,
leading to shorter maternal immunity, poor initial vaccine take, maybe non-responsiveness later.
It's complex. Dr. Rana linked rashless childhood measles to adult diseases. And again, the lack of studies comparing fully vaccinated versus never vaccinated kids is highlighted.
The book stresses the cellular immune system is key but hard to measure, and nutrition's role often gets missed in outbreak reports.
Especially vitamin A. It helps stop measles virus multiplying. Low levels mean worse outcomes. Its effectiveness is documented.
And the drop in measles deaths coincided with better nutrition generally.
Right. Vitamin A was even called an anti-infective vitamin early on. Dr. Ellison noted in 1932 that well-nourished kids rarely had severe measles.
What about SSPE, that rare brain complication? Reports of increased cases after vaccination.
The book mentions those reports and also MIBE, another brain issue seen in vaccinated kids, possibly linked to underlying immune problems.
There's that anecdote about the boy with eczema treated with ointment who then got nephrosis, suggesting suppression leading to deeper issues.
Following hearings laws, yeah. And briefly, the allegations against Merck about falsifying mumps vaccine data are noted.
The book also connects famine and malnutrition directly to disease susceptibility.
Makes sense. Famine means malnutrition, weakened immunity, disrupted life, worse conditions, spread of things like typhus via lice.
Historical accounts from Ireland, Russia, widespread starvation and disease going hand in hand.
That eyewitness account from Vermont about Ireland, grim. And the 1873 U.S. report on poor quality adulterated food in cities contributing to epidemics, especially in kids.
Then back to vitamin C, not just preventing scurvy, but treating infections.
Dr. Klenner's papers, again showing high-dose vitamin C effective against polio and measles, reducing fever, improving outcomes. He details treating a child with measles successfully.
Others reported success too.
Yes. And also for whooping cough, high doses showed promise in reducing severity, though large trials are lacking. Practitioners report using it for decades with benefits and no harm.
Any other alternative treatments mentioned?
Briefly, yes. Cinnamon for cold and measles, Dr. Drummond, 1917. Garlic for TB and whooping cough, 1917 article. Echinacea for smallpox, anthrax, burns, Drs. Adolphus and Matthews. Cod liver oil for TB and peripheral fever found very effective in studies. Colloidal silver for infections, Dr. Dvoretsky, 1901.
Interesting historical perspectives. The book also touches on the psychology of vaccine beliefs.
Suggests the perceived risk of a disease seems to go up after a vaccine is made. Measles, chickenpox, as examples. Fear driving compliance with mandates.
It contrasts Dr. Offit's portrayal of the Leicester movement with the book's own account.
Right. Offit's version suggests low vaccination led to disaster, which contradicts the book's earlier points about Leicester remaining largely outbreak-free despite low rates. It also questions Offit's whooping cough death stats compared to historical tables.
And an example of adverse reactions to scarlet fever toxin injections highlights potential risks of interventions. So wrapping up, the book really emphasizes the sheer number of vaccines kids get now, parental unease.
And poses those fundamental questions. What if the established view is wrong? What if the premise of vaccination is flawed? What are the real long-term effects?
And the big one. Despite many unvaccinated kids, there's been no comprehensive long-term study comparing health outcomes of fully vaccinated versus never vaccinated groups.
A critical point. The authors conclude that even top immunologists don't fully grasp everything that happens post-vaccination, and doctors should acknowledge these unknowns to patients.
Okay, so bringing it all together from this deep dive, the historical decline in infectious disease deaths seems strongly linked to huge improvements in sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, living conditions.
Often happening before vaccines were widely available or used for those specific diseases.
And we looked at the complexities of vaccine history itself. Contamination, failures, unintended consequences.
Alongside those alternative historical perspectives on treatment and prevention.
So, considering all this information we've unpacked, it really makes you think, doesn't it? About our current understanding of health, disease prevention, the role of medical interventions versus these broader societal factors.
What questions does this raise for you listening in about the information you receive on public health, on vaccination?
This is really just scratching the surface, of course.
Absolutely. We definitely encourage you to explore these topics further, look at the sources yourself, keep asking those critical questions, understanding our health history. It's an ongoing journey and a really important one.